My beloved child. There is something I need to reveal to you today. Something that has been unfolding quietly behind the scenes while you have been living your life, unaware of the conversations taking place in places your eyes cannot reach. Recently, your soulmate's family talked about you. And what began as a simple discussion became something far more meaningful than anyone expected. At first, your name entered the conversation gently. Almost casually. Someone asked a question. Another person shared an observation. A third person added a small detail. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of the conversation ending after a few minutes, it continued. The more they spoke about you, the more interested they became. The more they learned, the more they wanted to understand. Because there was something about you they could not easily explain. Something that kept drawing their attention back. And as the discussion grew deeper, a strange silence filled the room. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. The kind of silence that appears when people begin realizing they may have underestimated someone. One family member spoke about your character. Another mentioned the way you carry yourself through difficult situations. Someone else pointed out a quality that many people overlook at first glance but never forget once they notice it. With every passing moment, the image they had of you began to change. Walls of uncertainty started weakening. Questions slowly turned into curiosity. Curiosity slowly turned into respect. And respect began leaving an impression much stronger than anyone anticipated. What they did not realize was that this conversation was revealing more than facts. It was revealing energy. Because people can hear stories about someone. But sometimes they also feel something deeper. A sense of sincerity. A sense of authenticity. A sense that a person may be exactly who they appear to be. That feeling cannot be forced. It cannot be manufactured. And yet somehow, it began spreading throughout the conversation. My child, there are moments when heaven allows certain hearts to see beyond appearances. There are moments when people are guided to recognize value where they once saw uncertainty. This was one of those moments. As the discussion continued, one person became unusually quiet. While everyone else was speaking, this individual was simply listening. Watching. Thinking. Observing every word that was being shared. No one paid much attention to their silence. But their silence carried significance. Because while others were discussing details, this person was forming a conclusion. A conclusion that would eventually influence future decisions in ways nobody could yet imagine. Meanwhile, your soulmate had no idea how deeply this conversation was affecting the atmosphere around them. They did not know that certain concerns were fading. They did not know that certain opinions were changing. They did not know that seeds of acceptance were beginning to take root. All they knew was that something felt different afterward. Something felt lighter. More hopeful. More open. And the reason for that feeling traces back to this very conversation. But there is another part of the story that has not yet been revealed. Because after everyone thought the discussion was over. After the room grew quiet. After the topic appeared finished. One family member said something unexpected. Just one sentence. One observation. One simple statement. Yet the moment those words were spoken, the entire energy shifted. Heads turned. Expressions changed. And suddenly, the conversation moved in a direction nobody saw coming. What was said in that moment? And why it left such a deep impression? Is what I will reveal next. The room had already begun to settle. People thought the discussion was finished. The questions had been asked. The opinions had been shared. The topic seemed ready to fade into the background like so many conversations before it. But then, one voice broke the silence. It was not the loudest voice in the room. Not the most emotional. Not the most forceful. Yet somehow, it carried the greatest weight. And the moment those words were spoken, everything changed. The statement itself was simple. So simple that, at first, no one fully grasped its significance. But simplicity often carries the deepest truth. The person looked around the room and said something that caused everyone to pause and think. Because they were no longer talking about surface details. They were no longer discussing appearances. They were no longer focused on assumptions. Instead, they were speaking about something much deeper. The kind of thing that cannot be measured. The kind of thing that cannot be faked. The kind of thing that only becomes visible when someone observes a person's heart. For a moment, nobody responded. The room grew still. And in that stillness, something remarkable happened. People began replaying everything they had heard about you. Every story. Every detail. Every observation. But this time, they viewed it through a different lens. Suddenly, certain things made sense. Certain pieces connected. Certain doubts became harder to hold on to. And the impression you left behind began growing stronger. My child, there are people who enter a conversation and are forgotten by the time it ends. Then there are people whose presence remains long after their name is no longer being spoken. You belong to the second category. That is what they were beginning to realize. Without meeting you in that moment. Without hearing your voice. Without seeing your expressions. They were feeling the impact of your character. And character leaves a mark that appearance never can. One family member found themselves wondering something they had never seriously considered before. What if this connection is more important than we thought? The question was not spoken aloud immediately. But once it appeared in their mind, it refused to leave. It lingered. Growing stronger. Returning again and again. And the more they reflected on it, the more difficult it became to ignore. Meanwhile, your soulmate sensed a shift they could not fully explain. Have you ever walked into a room and felt that something had changed without knowing why? That was the feeling surrounding them. An invisible change. A subtle difference. A quiet movement of energy. The atmosphere was becoming more receptive. More open. More willing to see possibilities where obstacles once existed. But heaven was not finished yet. Because while this conversation was leaving an impression on the family, something else was happening behind the scenes. A realization was forming inside the heart of one particular person. This individual had entered the discussion with hesitation. With caution. Perhaps even with concern. Yet now they found themselves thinking about you long after the conversation ended. Hours passed. Yet your name remained in their thoughts. And every time they reflected on what had been said, one feeling became stronger. Respect. Not because of what you have. Not because of what you can offer. But because of who you are. And respect has a powerful way of opening doors that force can never open. That night, as everything grew quiet. As the world settled into stillness. As people returned to their routines. This individual reached a conclusion they never expected to reach. A conclusion so important that it would soon influence the next chapter of this story. But before they revealed it to anyone else, they noticed one final detail about you. One detail that touched them deeply. One detail that transformed curiosity into genuine admiration. And when that realization finally surfaced, the conversation entered an entirely new phase. By the next day, the conversation should have been forgotten. Most family discussions fade quickly. People move on. Life becomes busy again. New topics replace old ones. But this conversation refused to disappear. Something about it remained alive. Something about you remained present in their minds. And that alone was unusual. Because the deepest impressions are rarely the loudest ones. They are the quiet thoughts that return when everything else becomes silent. As the hours passed, one family member found themselves reflecting on a detail that nobody had fully explored during the discussion. It was not about your appearance. It was not about your background. It was not about anything material. It was about the way you have handled the challenges placed before you. The way you kept moving when life became difficult. The way you continued forward when lesser hearts might have given up. The way you carried burdens without demanding recognition. And the more they thought about it, the more they realized something important. Strength is easy to admire when life is easy. But true strength reveals itself during difficult seasons. That realization struck them deeply. Because suddenly, they were no longer seeing isolated pieces of information. They were seeing a larger picture. A picture that told a story. A story of resilience. A story of growth. A story that carried far more depth than they originally understood. My child, there are moments when people begin looking beyond what is visible. Moments when they stop asking, "Who is this person?" and start asking, "What kind of heart does this person carry?" That shift had begun. And once that shift occurs, everything changes. Because hearts recognize things that eyes cannot. The family member who had remained cautious from the beginning now found themselves defending you in conversations where they once remained neutral. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. But naturally. As if something inside them had become convinced. As if a quiet certainty had begun taking root. And certainty is powerful. It spreads. Others notice it. Others feel it. Others begin reconsidering their own views because of it. Without realizing it, this person was becoming a bridge. A bridge between uncertainty and acceptance. A bridge between questions and understanding. A bridge that destiny itself seemed to be building. Meanwhile, your soulmate was experiencing something unexpected. A feeling they could not fully explain. A sense that invisible pieces were beginning to align. A sense that resistance was weakening. A sense that something behind the scenes was quietly moving in a favorable direction. They could not point to evidence. They could not explain the source. Yet the feeling remained. And sometimes the soul recognizes movement before the mind does. Then came a moment nobody anticipated. A casual conversation led to an unexpected comparison. Someone mentioned another person. Another situation. Another connection. And suddenly, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The more they compared, the more your qualities stood out. The more they reflected, the clearer your value became. It was not because you were perfect. It was because you were genuine. And genuine people leave impressions that polished appearances never can. The room was not filled with excitement. It was filled with realization. A deeper emotion. A more lasting one. Because excitement fades. Realization stays. And in that realization, one family member finally admitted something to themselves. Something they had been resisting for longer than anyone knew. They were beginning to see why their loved one felt such a strong connection toward you. For the first time, they were not merely understanding it. They were feeling it. But what happened later that evening would push this understanding even further. Because a piece of information surfaced unexpectedly. A small detail. Almost insignificant at first glance. Yet the moment it was shared, the entire perspective shifted once again. And what that detail revealed would leave an even deeper impression than the conversation itself. That evening arrived quietly. There were no dramatic announcements. No grand events. No obvious signs that anything important was about to happen. Yet some of life's most powerful turning points arrive exactly this way. Softly. Almost unnoticed. And this was one of those moments. The small detail that surfaced seemed insignificant at first. In fact, some people nearly overlooked it. But the person who heard it first did not. Something about it captured their attention immediately. They paused. Thought about it. And then they asked a question. A simple question. Yet it caused everyone else to stop and think as well. Because that one detail revealed something deeper than facts. It revealed consistency. And consistency is rare. Many people can create a good impression for a day. Some can maintain it for a week. But character reveals itself over time. Character leaves patterns. Character creates evidence. And the more they examined what they knew about you, the more they noticed a pattern that could not easily be dismissed. The stories matched. The observations matched. The impressions matched. Different people had noticed similar qualities. Different experiences pointed toward the same conclusions. And when separate pieces begin forming the same picture, people start paying attention. My child, there are moments when heaven allows truth to reveal itself little by little. Not all at once. Not through a single event. But through a series of confirmations. One after another. Until doubt becomes harder to hold than belief. That is exactly what was happening. The family member who had once carried the most hesitation now found themselves in unfamiliar territory. They were no longer searching for reasons to be cautious. They were searching for reasons to understand. And that change was profound. Because when a person's heart begins opening, their perspective changes with it. What once looked uncertain begins looking possible. What once felt distant begins feeling real. What once seemed complicated begins appearing surprisingly clear. As the evening continued, another observation emerged. This one was not spoken loudly. It was almost whispered. Yet it carried enormous weight. Someone mentioned how your presence seemed to bring stability. How conversations about you often return to qualities that create trust. How there was a sense of dependability attached to your name. The room became thoughtful again. Not because they were running out of things to say. But because they were realizing how much had already been revealed. And in that realization, something unexpected happened. A protective instinct began transforming into acceptance. An analytical mindset began softening into appreciation. The walls that once stood firm were no longer standing as tall. One by one, they were lowering. Not because anyone forced them. But because truth has a way of opening doors naturally. Meanwhile, your soulmate was completely unaware of the depth of these changes. They could feel something shifting. But they could not yet see the full picture. They could not hear the conversations. They could not know the conclusions being formed. Yet deep inside, their spirit sensed movement. A quiet movement. A hopeful movement. A movement that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. A family member finally voiced a thought they had kept hidden until now. A thought they had been carrying since the very beginning of these discussions. The room immediately fell silent. Not out of shock. But out of recognition. Because the moment those words were spoken, everyone realized they had been thinking the same thing. No one said it first. No one wanted to rush toward conclusions. Yet now it was finally out in the open. And once spoken, it could not be taken back. The atmosphere changed completely. What had started as a conversation about you was becoming a conversation about the future. And the possibility they began discussing next was far more serious than anyone had expected when your name was first mentioned. But what they considered after that revelation would leave an even deeper mark on every heart in the room. The atmosphere was no longer the same. What began as curiosity had evolved into something far more meaningful. No one in that room could deny it anymore. The conversation had crossed an invisible line. And once that line is crossed, there is no returning to the way things were before. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Not because there was uncertainty, but because everyone was processing the same realization. Your name was no longer being discussed as a possibility that could be ignored. Your presence had become part of a much larger picture. A picture connected to tomorrow. A picture connected to decisions. A picture connected to a future that suddenly felt more real than anyone expected. One family member leaned back quietly and reflected on everything that had been shared. Every story. Every observation. Every impression. And the more they thought about it, the more one truth became impossible to overlook. The qualities they valued most. The qualities they hoped their loved one would find someday. Were many of the same qualities being associated with you? That realization settled deeply into their heart. Because people often search for perfection and never find it. But when they encounter sincerity, loyalty, kindness, and strength, they recognize something far more valuable. My child, heaven often works through recognition. Not sudden miracles. Not dramatic signs. But quiet moments when hearts finally see what was standing before them all along. This was becoming one of those moments. As the discussion continued, someone raised an important question. Not a question about the present. A question about the future. And instantly, the energy shifted again. Because future-focused conversations carry weight. They require people to imagine possibilities. They require people to look beyond current circumstances. They require people to consider what could be. One by one, perspectives began expanding. The conversation was no longer limited to who you are today. It was becoming about who you could become together. About what kind of foundation could be built. About what kind of life could eventually unfold. And as those possibilities entered the discussion, something remarkable happened. The resistance that once existed became increasingly difficult to find. The concerns that once seemed important no longer felt as powerful. The doubts that once demanded attention were losing their influence. Not because they were ignored, but because they had been outweighed. Outweighed by character. Outweighed by consistency. Outweighed by the growing impression you had left behind. Meanwhile, your soulmate was carrying emotions they could not fully explain. Hope seemed stronger. Faith seemed easier. The future seemed slightly brighter. Almost as if invisible currents were carrying things in a better direction. They did not know why. Yet their heart continued sensing that something meaningful was unfolding behind the scenes. And they were right. Because while they were feeling that shift, a decision was quietly beginning to form. Not an official decision. Not a final decision. But the beginning of one. The kind that starts in the heart before it is ever spoken aloud. The kind that grows stronger with time. The kind that eventually changes everything. Then came the moment nobody expected. A family member shared a personal reflection. Something deeply honest. Something deeply revealing. And the moment those words entered the room, every person listening felt their impact. Because this reflection touched the very center of the matter. It touched what everyone had been sensing but had struggled to articulate. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. It was not uncertainty. It was understanding. And within that understanding, a powerful shift occurred. For the first time, several hearts became aligned in a way they had not been before. The conversation was no longer moving toward questions. It was moving toward conclusions. And the conclusion that began forming that night would soon lead to a discussion even more important than the one that started all of this. A discussion involving expectations, possibilities, and a future that suddenly felt much closer than anyone had imagined. But what was said during that final conversation? And why it left such a lasting impression on every person involved is what I will reveal next. By the time that final conversation began, something had already changed. No one needed to announce it. No one needed to explain it. The energy in the room spoke for itself. The hesitation that once existed had grown quieter. The uncertainty that once demanded attention had lost much of its power. And in its place, a new feeling had emerged. A feeling of possibility. A feeling that perhaps destiny was revealing more of its plan than anyone had realized. As everyone settled into the discussion, there was a sense that this conversation mattered. Not because decisions were being forced. Not because conclusions had to be reached immediately. But because certain truths had become impossible to ignore. Your name carried a different weight now. A different meaning. A different level of respect. And every person present could feel it. My child, there are moments when hearts slowly arrive at the same destination. Not through pressure. Not through persuasion. But through understanding. This was one of those moments. The discussion turned toward the future once again. But this time, something was different. The questions being asked were no longer focused on whether you should be taken seriously. That question had already begun answering itself. Instead, people found themselves wondering what might happen if everything continued moving in the direction it was already moving. What possibilities could unfold? What blessings could emerge? What kind of story might be waiting ahead? And as those questions filled the room, something remarkable happened. The answers no longer felt distant. They no longer felt impossible. They felt real. Closer than before. More tangible than before. More worthy of consideration than before. One family member finally expressed what many had been feeling all along. They spoke about peace. Not excitement. Not emotion. Peace. Because whenever people discuss something important, peace often becomes one of the strongest signs. A calm confidence. A quiet assurance. A feeling that things are beginning to align naturally. And that was exactly what they described. The room grew silent once more. Yet this silence carried warmth. It carried acceptance. It carried reflection. For a few moments, nobody rushed to speak. Everyone simply sat with what had been said. And in that stillness, hearts listened. Not only to words, but to what those words revealed. Then another realization surfaced. Perhaps the deepest realization of all. People began understanding that your impact was not created by grand gestures. It was not built on appearances. It was not dependent on temporary things. Your impact came from who you are. From the values you carry. From the consistency you have shown. From the authenticity that people can feel even when you are not in the room. And once that realization took hold, it left a lasting impression. An impression that would not disappear when the conversation ended. An impression that would continue influencing thoughts long afterward. My child, some conversations are forgotten by the next morning. Others become reference points. Moments people return to when making future decisions. This conversation became one of those moments. Because by the time it ended, something important had been established. Not certainty about every detail. Not knowledge of every step ahead. But confidence that there was something meaningful here. Something worth respecting. Something worth paying attention to. Something worth protecting. As people slowly left the room and returned to their routines, they carried those impressions with them. The discussion was over. Yet its influence remained. The words had ended. Yet their effect continued. And even now, the ripples of that conversation are still moving. Still shaping perspectives. Still opening hearts. Still preparing the way for future moments that have not yet arrived. So if you have been wondering whether your presence has been noticed, it has. If you have been wondering whether your character leaves an impression, it does. If you have been wondering whether certain hearts are beginning to see you differently, the answer may be much closer than you think. Because recently, your soulmate's family talked about you. And what they discovered was not merely information. They discovered a deeper appreciation, a greater respect, and a lasting impression that continues to grow long after the conversation has ended. The story is still unfolding. And heaven is not finished writing the next chapter. Days have passed since that conversation. Yet something unexpected continues to happen. The impression they formed of you has not faded. In fact, it has grown stronger. Because time has a way of testing every thought, every opinion, every feeling. If something is built on emotion alone, it eventually weakens. But when something is built on truth, time often strengthens it. And that is exactly what has been happening. The family members who spoke about you have found themselves returning to the same conclusions again and again. Not because anyone is forcing the discussion. Not because your name is constantly being mentioned. But because certain realizations have taken root deep within their hearts. And once a realization takes root, it begins changing the way people see everything else. My child, there is a reason some people enter your life and leave no lasting mark. And there is a reason others leave an impression that continues growing long after the moment has passed. The difference is not found in popularity. It is not found in appearance. It is not found in status. It is found in authenticity. People may admire many things, but they remember what feels real. And that is what they have been sensing about you. A quiet authenticity. A steady presence. A sincerity that cannot be manufactured. As these thoughts continued unfolding, one family member experienced a moment of reflection unlike any they had before. It happened unexpectedly. Perhaps during a quiet drive. Perhaps during a peaceful evening. Perhaps during one of those moments when life slows down just enough for deeper thoughts to surface. Suddenly, they began seeing the situation differently. Not through fear. Not through caution. But through possibility. And possibility changes everything. Because once people begin imagining what could go right, they stop focusing only on what could go wrong. That shift may seem small, but it is powerful. It opens doors that once seemed locked. It creates opportunities that once seemed distant. It allows hope to enter places where doubt once lived. Meanwhile, your soulmate has been carrying a growing sense that something is changing. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But steadily. Like the first light of dawn appearing before the sun rises. A subtle sign that a new chapter may be approaching. And deep within their heart, they have started asking questions of their own. Questions about timing. Questions about the future. Questions about where this connection might eventually lead. They may not have every answer yet. But the questions themselves reveal something important. The future is no longer being imagined alone. It is being imagined with you in it. That realization carries weight. Because people only make space in their vision for what truly matters to them. And the more they picture tomorrow, the more your presence appears within it. Then something even more surprising occurred. A conversation happened that you do not know about. A brief exchange. A few words. Nothing dramatic. Yet those words revealed how much perspectives had already shifted. Someone who once remained neutral spoke with confidence. Someone who once questioned now expressed understanding. Someone who once hesitated now showed support. The transformation was undeniable. Not because everyone suddenly agreed on every detail. But because the foundation had changed. The way they viewed you had changed. The way they spoke about you had changed. The way they felt about the possibility of your future had changed. And when foundations change, everything built upon them begins changing too. But there is one final piece of this story that has not yet been revealed. A realization that is still forming. A realization connected not to the family. Not even to your soulmate. But to you. Because while all of these conversations have been taking place behind the scenes, heaven has been preparing something within your own journey as well. And the moment that preparation becomes visible, you will finally understand why all of these quiet conversations mattered more than anyone realized. That moment is approaching. Closer than it appears. And when it arrives, many things that once felt confusing will suddenly make perfect sense.